So we're going to talk to you about the open source project security baseline today, and we're going to and why it's really cool for securing your open source projects. Mike, take it away.
Sure. A little bit of background for myself. I'm Mike Lieberman, co-founder and CTO of Kusari. Do a whole bunch of stuff in software supply chain security, third-party risk management, that sort of stuff. I also do a whole lot in open source. I'm a member of the Open Source Security Foundation's governing board, a member of the Technical Advisory Council, and I'm also a maintainer of projects like Guac and Salsa. And in addition to that, one of the things that's probably worth highlighting is I used to be the co-chair of the financial services user group in CNCF back when I used to work at banks like MUFG and Citi.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen Augustus. I'm a technical architect in the office of the CTO at Bloomberg, so I spend a lot of time with our open source program office initiatives. I spend a little time upstream too, so similar to Mike, I'm also on the Technical Advisory Council for the Open Source Security Foundation. I'm also one of the steering committee members and maintainers of a project called Scorecard, which helps you analyze the risk of your open source projects. And then finally, I spend a little time in a small project called Kubernetes, one of the steering committee members for Kubernetes. I'm also one of the SIG release chairs. So my team is responsible for releasing Kubernetes, and I've been doing that for the last 6 or 7 years. So.
Yep, it always seems like everything's on fire, right? Especially in open source here.
So whether you're, so we've got a lot of things to deal with, right, across the landscape. It's whether it's vulnerabilities, supply chain attacks, misconfigurations of your cluster. It feels like technology seems to be out to get us, right? When we're working in open source software, and I think specifically in trying to reason about and secure these threats across your internal landscape and also across open source projects that you may manage. So let's take a little look at the threats.
Yeah, so this is a diagram that comes from the Salsa project. It really sort of highlights what software supply chain security is. So software supply chain security is securing the SDLC, and not just, and one of the things that should be kind of pointed out there is dependencies are part of that SDLC, and those dependencies blow up into that same box, and you want to know, hey, is the downstream projects that you're looking at following all the good things to protect themselves? Because if they're not protecting themselves and you pull it in, that potentially means you're not protecting yourself. So the thing here is, of course, every single one of these boxes, every single one of these arrows, every single one of the actors in there is a potential area of compromise. And let's kind of...
Yeah, so I'm actually curious, how many people in the audience are working in financial services? I mean, just based on the conference, I imagine quite a few. How many people are working in open source technology as their day-to-day? Anyone in a open source program office? Okay, cool.
Cool.
So, few threats that we want to put into focus. I think, some of it is the stuff that we do, the stuff that we may do as open source developers, as people who are, going to Mike's point again, have to worry about and reason about the dependencies that we're pulling into our software development lifecycle. Reviewing and authoring commits can be dangerous at times. I think especially if we've seen some of the recent attacks just related to maintainer reputation or onboarding new maintainers who have not necessarily been as trustworthy as expected. Mike, you want to talk to some of the software source code stuff?
Sure, yeah. So if folks remember from a few years ago, the CodeCov issues where, hey, incorrect security settings led their repos to actually be compromised, which then allowed sort of malicious code to kind of go in there. And we've seen sort of similar stuff like that recently with the Shai Hulud
Shai-Hulud was pretty interesting, and I think is it still happening? Is it still kind of like
Potentially, yeah.
yeah?
Seems like yesterday there might have been a similar attack. So
Some attacks may not even be explicitly malicious, right? Can be, so thinking about typo squatting, that is not always explicitly malicious, but can be used for malicious purposes. Where you're publishing your artifacts is important. Who is building? What is being built? You are often, as open source package producers or consumers, you are extending either expecting trust from your consumers or extending trust into your environment based on where you live in that on that production life cycle. But
hey, it's not all bad, right? There's a lot of work, especially in the open source community, which is great. Stuff like the supply chain security best practices and secure software factory reference architecture, which has come out of the CNCF, right? Lots of things around standards around security best practices, things like SALSA, things like scorecard. And then I think the other thing that's been happening a lot lately, folks who are probably familiar with DORA and similar sorts of regulatory legislation that's out there, there's a lot of push from the government to start holding organizations accountable to maintaining a bar for security.
Yeah, so I think, Mike, to your point, a lot of open source foundations, organizations are creating their own specifications. So the OpenSSF, Open Source Security Foundation, has several of them. But we're noticing in further afield, especially from SDOs. So I'm curious, Mike, how do banks solve this today?
Yeah, so hey, I've been there. I've been a manager at a bank. I've also been an engineer at a bank. I've seen this before, right? Hey, you have third-party risk management. A lot of times, if you're part of that third-party risk management, you're often doing manual analysis. You're often running scans on actual projects. You're dealing with a lot of things there. You're dealing with tickets, so many tickets, spreadsheets, so many spreadsheets. You're getting an email from your manager saying, hey, I got an alert from, some team that says that you're using something that you're not supposed to be using, and, please go fix it. And, as an engineer, you're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on, and you're trying to make sure, like, did I give them the wrong project to look at, whatever it may be. And then if you're in third-party risk management, you're probably spending so much time looking at, like, why did this person ask me to review a project that's written by a single maintainer? It hasn't been maintained in 3 months. What's going on here?
So surely there's like an automated mechanism for doing all of that, right?
Depends on the organization. Some are a little bit further along than others. I know in my time, there were some organizations I've worked at where there was some automation, and there were some organizations where it was a very long, arduous process.
So I think that like the dependency review cycle, like 3-month window for dependency reviews for a project that's maybe releasing every 2 weeks, that seems reasonable, right?
Yeah. So I've definitely seen my fair share of, you need to, a third-party risk management process, right? Looks like, hey, make sure you're giving us a recent release of the project. If it takes 3 months for them to review it, and that project has released multiple releases since then, they say, hey, it's been rejected because you didn't actually give me a recent release. And it's like, well, I give you a recent release when I open up the ticket, and so, hey, we need a better way, right? And so like this is kind of what it looks like today. Again, very, very simplified, right? But hey, you open up a ticket, the TPRM team, third-party risk management team, right? Looks at code scans. Maybe they are using OpenSSF scorecard or their own internal scoring mechanisms. They're running vulnerability scans. They're generating reports, and they approve or reject that project.
But again, to Mike's point earlier, it does kind of feel like, I've opened a ticket, it goes into a black hole, I think, and then eventually stuff happens, and the stuff is often a rejection.
Yeah, and again, like, it's played up here a little bit, like not everything is this bad, but especially when you are working towards a release, you're under pressure to kind of deliver on stuff. having to open up yet another ticket or for approval for some open source tool that everybody else uses can be very, very frustrating.
So we've got the current world, right? And we've got, again, the long-running scans, the expensive investigations, I think both in cost as well as in time taken across all of the stakeholder teams, and then lots of incorrect assumptions about open source software, consumption of open source software, our responsibilities therein. And what if there was a brave new world, right, where you could just scans were verifications of things that people attested that they did, and projects agreed to do that on a consistent basis, right? So that's hopefully what the world would look like, right? You consume these scans, right? And we have some means of, each company, each organization has some means of verifying how to do that, right? So let's look at what that solution could be.
Yeah, so this is potentially a very, very large and broad sort of view of what this kind of looks like in open source. So these are a bunch of CNCF projects, OpenSSF projects involved in sort of security. At the top, you have like software production focused things. So like, hey, as a project, I want to do all the right security things. I want to do Salsa. I want to do Scorecard. I want to, wrap all my builds in Witness. I want to be able to distribute all this metadata, like my software bill of materials and Salsa, et cetera, through something like Guac, right, to sort of analyze all that. I want to look at, things like OSV and deps.dev to figure out information about the software that I'm consuming, as well as the software I'm producing. And then, down here as a consumer, right, and this is what most of you are probably more focused on, is, hey, I want to make sure that the software I'm consuming, the open source software I'm consuming, is good, it's not free of vulnerabilities, that it's not a single maintainer project. Like, hey, if it's my personal blog, I'm okay with a single maintainer project. If it's, part of my mobile banking application, probably not, right? And then on the left-hand side, you have sort of like the rules by which this should all be governed. These are things like, for folks who are familiar, like SigStore, so signatures and signing and attesting to stuff. And then down here, baseline, which we'll talk about a little bit more.
So an in-depth look at some of the solutions. We kind of have the policy and insight, as you mentioned. So if you've worked on, if you've worked in and around Kubernetes, you may have seen things like Kyverno and Open Policy, where you can define some of the expectations of what should be happening within your running clusters, ways of aggregating that information. So to Mike's point about Guac, attesting that information is actually accurate. And then you have trust foundations. You have things like SigStore, which is a digital public good, being able to pull signatures and verify that things are coming from the places that we expect them to. So we're about to talk about regulations. We're going to do the big, should we have put this in red? Maybe we should have put this in red.
Yeah.
We are not your lawyers. We are not lawyers at all. We are engineers. Mike, you were very generous to say that we are engineers. But yeah, we work on solving software problems, and sometimes those are related to regulations, or sometimes those are bound within the constructs of new regulations. So.
Some organizations, ours in particular, those who can identify that a risk exists are different than those who can assess the magnitude of that risk. And the people that address the magnitude may not be software engineers. And
yep.
So some of this goes, and so they, any risk for them is equally valid. And so the noise to signal ratio is high in terms of the span that the software engineering teams will get.
Absolutely. So just for the sake of the recording and just for everyone else, thank you for the comment. We are going to have discussion at the end of the presentation. Just for the recording, there's an idea of like toxic combinations, right? Like what can actually be exploited, the people who understand, and the likelihood that thing can happen, right? So that is really important. I think having stakeholders in the room, the right stakeholders, right?
Yeah, and I think the other thing, part of it is something we're not going to solve here because in the that sort of world, but I do think that we are starting to see, especially with, and we'll talk about this actually in a couple of slides here, but like with these upcoming regulations, I'm actually happy about some of them because they are pushing GRC and the engineering a little bit tighter together, where you can't just sort of look at these things in a vacuum because of all the issues that I think you had sort of brought up there. But again, it's kind of that cultural shift that will take a long time.
So I think it is weird to say, but I'm also excited about regulation because I think it is encouraging. I was going to say forcing. In some places, it is encouraging people to be a bit more deliberate about the way they produce software, about the way they present it to the world, really, right? And open source software, we're going to spare you the usual XKCD picture of the little lib Nebraska maintainer who's like maintaining this critical software project that you've been using since like 2003 or something, right? But yeah, it forces, I think, everyone in the life cycle to consider how they're producing software and how they're consuming it.
Yep.
So.
Sure. So again, there's a lot more to DORA than just this, but for the purposes of sort of third-party risks here, right? Hey, your third-party external vendors, as well as your open source dependencies, sort of fall under DORA, and the sorts of things you should be doing around vulnerability management processes and things like software bill of materials kind of falls under this. And so, hey, you are not there's all sorts of regulations across the world that are sort of focusing on this, but I think things that are relatively new, like DORA, are like saying, no, you have to do this now. And then, for folks who are not familiar with the CRA or the Cyber Resilience Act, that is a regulation. It hasn't gone into full effect yet. Starting next year, if you create a product with digital elements, you will have to you are responsible essentially for the open source dependencies that you use. So if there's a vulnerability, you can't just say, oh, it's not my fault, it's the open source developer's fault. You take on that responsibility. Yep. So why should you care, right? And then in addition, hey, isn't this already covered under DORA? Actually, potentially you might be covered under both. If you're just sort of running your banking systems, hey, that's DORA. But if you sort of release something like a mobile banking application, that is a product with digital elements, and you are probably fall under that. Again, we are not your lawyers.
Not your lawyers. Not your lawyers. All right, so more on the CRA. So 2026, this is coming up really soon. I think for all these deadlines, it's easy to not be preparing. We're giving you about a year of advance notice. Vulnerability reporting is going into effect, and then by the end of 2027, we're expecting the CRA to go into full effect. You must comply with everything that is written down if you are transiting software in that way.
Yeah, so again, it's just worth repeating. If you are using open source software, you are responsible for it, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you need to fix everything yourself, but you need to know what to do when a vulnerability comes in. Does that mean I'm updating it? Hey, it's been end-of-lifed. Hey, I should probably figure out what to do and how to move off of it.
So we talked about a better way of potentially reasoning about some of these risks in your organizations, in your open source software projects, and the better way is called the Open Source Project Security Baseline.
So it's essentially just a minimum set of requirements, around security. So really there's two main sort of stakeholders here. You have producers who now have the ability to follow some baseline set of security requirements, but I think more importantly, it's a way for maintainers to tell the world, hey, this is what to expect from my project. Here are my maintainers, here's my security policy, here's my dependency management policy, and if you don't like it, hey, that's fine. We can maybe have a chat if that's something that the maintainer's up for. Otherwise, go find something else. Go find another project if it's not up to your standards. And that, I think, ties into then consumers, where consumers now are more informed. They don't have to send emails to maintainers saying, hey, what's going on here? I don't see a security policy. I don't see any of this stuff. And I realize that I'm using all of your things, and I'm now compromised due to something. So I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Hey, with stuff like Baseline trying to help folks solve that so you can make more informed decisions.
So I know we talked about manual work a little earlier. And I'm sure you're all wondering as attendees, is it another spreadsheet? Like, no, but also kind of yes. So I'm going to walk you through. So Baseline is a control framework. It's a controls catalog. It's a so I mean the great idea around Baseline is that eventually we should be able to bring automation into the fore around the control framework. So you should be able to say, hey, I'm using this tool to check this, and it can bubble up into, yes, this baseline control has been satisfied as a result. So let's take a look at a baseline control. This one should look pretty familiar to people in that if you're using CodeForge like GitHub, you may have, if you're an org owner, enterprise owner, you will have received messages from GitHub maybe a few years ago at this point, saying that they were going to enforce two-factor authentication for all users on GitHub, right? And I think if anyone in this room is responsible for managing that process, that often involved like one, great user documentation in addition to the GitHub documentation, lots of additional pings to your users, teaching people how to use 2FA mechanisms for the first time. So what you'll notice in this controls framework is that, one, it establishes a requirement. It talks about some recommendations for what to do in the specific venue, in this case, your CodeForge. And then it does, I think, the best part for me, external mappings framework, right? So we've got external mappings across the OpenSSF Best Practices Badge, Cyber Resilience Act, the SSDF, CSF, as well as OCRE, and I think there may be a few more frameworks mapped, but effectively what has happened is a bunch of smart people have read all of these documents for you. So instead of you doing that work, they are going to tell you exactly what you're satisfying when you work on this control, right? So just to break down the control system, because everyone loves a little nomenclature in the morning. Are we still in the morning? Yeah. So open source project security, right? Dash. The control family abbreviation, and then dash the index within that control family. And there are indices across the control families are access control, build and release, documentation, governance, legal, quality, security assessment, and vulnerability management. So what's kind of cool about this is,
yeah, you could be doing this already. Again, right now it's pretty manual, but it's also very simple stuff that you're probably already doing with some of your own projects, and you should be looking at other projects to sort of see if they're doing those sorts of things. And again, if you are maintaining projects, if you work at an OSPO and you're like, hey, we have some of our own projects that we do release to the outside world, it's going to be super useful to kind of do that. But really, it's 3 levels. Level 1, super simple, basic stuff, documentation, that kind of thing. Level 2 is like, hey, you actually have a couple of maintainers. This is something that you're sort of building out. And then level 3 is like, maybe this is something that is production ready, something that is should be security sensitive, something like that.
and you will see if you spend any time in like Linux Foundation directed fund projects that they will often have something in the way of a maturity model for the projects, right? So CNCF has Sandbox incubating graduated, OpenSSF has the same. The OpenSSF, we're actually working on applying the baseline as project maturity expectations and requirements for each of our projects. So going into the OpenSSF, you should understand that your projects are protected. The CI is protected. We have ways of gathering information, both as project maintainers and consumers, and the usual good bits around licensing, the security policies and maintenance, right? So I'll speak kind of as a person who has run and been in OSPOs for a little while now, it's a great way to maintain a good reputation within your communities for projects that you are, the github.com/Bloomberg, the github.com/Kusari dev, having people trust the projects that you're doing, having people understand the best practices that you're following, how to communicate both internally. I think one of the most frustrating things to deal with sometimes is having a conversation with internal maintainers are maintainers of a project that is largely managed by a corporation, right? And figuring out how to reach into that corporation and get information. So being able to chat with your external stakeholders, as well as talk to them about how to comply with regulations, right? And that's kind of broadly what you would expect, right?
Yeah, the one thing that's probably worth just highlighting there is like by a manifest, hey, one of the big things that the baseline tries to push for is describe what you are doing in a easily discoverable way to those who are then consuming you. So as opposed to saying, well, it's up to you to figure out where my SBOM lives, where my security policy, security.md lives, does it live under a governance repo, blah, blah, blah. Have something like a manifest that folks can then sort of consume and say, oh, your security.md actually lives under governance repo or something like that.
And Mike, why don't you tell them a little bit about the TPRM experience moving forward?
Yeah, so like I think one of some of the big things here is like stop making assumptions about open source projects. If projects are following baseline, you'll know what they are, what the expectations are. You'll know what their release cycle is like, what their end of life policies might be. So it allows you to sort of make risk-based decisions based on what is explicitly declared by a project as opposed to inferring. And then you can verify that those practices are actually being followed through scans and all these other things, but you don't have to play that guessing game. So then what you're doing, right, is, hey, if that other thing was all those various security practices and you're sort of declaring what you're doing, well, now I can consume that manifest and then go through those security practices as I need to and regularly sort of like audit it. Or maybe in the future there could be third-party auditors that can actually run those checks as well. So there's a couple of early adopters, not a ton. Again, the project itself is still pretty new, but it is growing pretty quickly with Guac, bombctl, and OpenTelemetry.
So in this magical new world, like we are expecting simplified third-party risk management, again, the abilities to easily consume that baseline metadata, so long as it's clean and well understandable, and increasing the visibility, increasing the discoverability, fewer spreadsheets, hopefully in the future, right? And then tracking changes as they're published, right? So we should be able to, moving forward in a system like this, we should be able to detect those changes as a result of new releases, and that metadata is being consistently published across the venues that you want to pick it up at, right?
Yeah, and for the future, this is being pushed pretty heavily at the Linux Foundation with an expectation in the future that all projects underneath the Linux Foundation will sort of apply baseline. There's also a push to get this, baseline to be recognized by some of the regulatory bodies as a way to provide that evidence. In fact, actually, I'll be in Belgium next week chatting with folks about this in the EU.
So the new and existing tools, so we've got things that people have been working on, things that people have been working on for a while, and things and tools that are emergent as a result of this baseline effort. Scorecard, shameless plug. If you're not using Scorecard today, please check it out. Please file bugs, issues, scream at me and the maintainers if you want to. It's a really good tool. Part of the reason that I maintain it today was because I was looking for a tool that solved that problem, and I didn't want to write it myself. So now I spend time writing Scorecard. Minder, Privateer on the kind of assessment framework level. For the remediation side, again, Minder, Darnit is a tool that Mike has been working on at Kusari. And on the policy level, Scorecard also has a GitHub app called All-Star. It's also pretty cool if you're looking at running Scorecard across your entire GitHub org. You can do that with All-Star. Sorry for the GitLab folks. BND and then Ample are other tools that are working on policy remediation as well, right?
Yep. Please come. Like, we need end user feedback. We'd love to hear from folks who have been playing around with it, especially at the consumer end, and saying, "Hey, we'd love to know what a real big worry for us is this sort of risk coming from open source." Great. Let's iterate on the baseline for future releases, and then as well as for folks from the OSPO, "Hey, here's the things that I think would make it easier for us to follow these rules."
Yep. So if you want to stay in touch with us, we've got all the socials and goodness. Leave that up for a while for you to take pictures.